All right, here we go. Hey, everybody. We're going to talk about agents in healthcare and life sciences today. I'm James. I'm lead architect for all life sciences AI.
Hi, and my name is Will Smith. I'm the lead architect for AI for healthcare.
Yeah, and between the two of us, the reason we're the ones speaking today is over the past few years, we've done hundreds of AI customer use cases on Databricks. We went back for this session, we went back and looked through our calendars over the last few years, and we totaled them all up. So we're looking forward to this.
Yep. And a little bit about us, too, in addition to that. I used to be a medical researcher at the National Institutes of Health, so very much into the clinical space in healthcare.
And I used to work for Takeda Pharmaceuticals prior to joining Databricks, so I've spent my whole career in life sciences as well. Yeah.
Sweet. So today, this is what we're going to aim to talk about, and hopefully it's an exciting session. Thank you so much for coming out. Today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about what are AI agents. There's a lot of conversation around it. There's a lot of shared definitions and stuff like that. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page and that everybody can figure out what we're talking about as we go deeper and deeper into the space. Some considerations for AI agents in HLS, healthcare and life sciences. This is an HLS session, and it's incredibly important. We have very specific requirements as well as considerations that we want to talk about. We'll then do an end-to-end demo of an actual agentic system with evaluations, which is something that we definitely want to emphasize, and we'll talk more about that. We'll talk a little bit about some of the use cases that we've seen, some of the higher profile ones, especially agent-to-agent systems. And then we'll end with some main takeaways. If you're going to get one thing from the session, we just want to make sure we hammer that home.
All right, so it's a classic thing to use an Andrej Karpathy quote before an AI session. And I think this is an interesting one because he's talking about how this is the year of agents, everybody's talking about it, but it's actually really difficult to do this well still. So it's going to be a long journey to not just build agents. It's not the hard part. The hard part is actually getting it right. So we're going to talk today not just about building agents, we're going to talk about how to get it right and some of the things that we've seen go right in healthcare and life sciences. All right, so I'm going to start with sort of, I'm not doing this to teach necessarily. I think we all know what agents are. I'm doing this more to have some shared definitions that when we go into the demo, we're all talking about things the same way. Lots of vendors talk about agents, of course, but there's a difference between agents embedded in a software, kind of like the Databricks assistant, versus agents that you build yourselves, right? So we're going to talk about the building blocks of that, how it looks and feels, and then when we do the demo, we're actually going to build an agent together. So I'm going to do a little laser pointer here just so I can point things out. Agents are not monolithic models, right? It's not ChatGPT. And there's a lot of things that an agent could be, but to distill it down to the simplest definition, an agent is just an LLM with resources at its disposal, right? And we call those tools, not Databricks, but everybody. Those resources are tools. And what tools are, actually, before I go to the next slide, what tools are sometimes it's an API, sometimes that's a way to retrieve structured data, and sometimes it's a way to retrieve unstructured data or something in between, right? So we're going to talk about how to build tools. We're going to show that in the demo today. We're going to talk about how to combine those tools with an LLM to build agents. And in 2023, 2024, we all built what we call RAG chatbots, right? Retrieval Augmented Generation. And we all built them, and maybe we didn't see as much value as we expected out of them, right? We all built sort of PDF chatbots. We all built sort of employee handbook RAG chatbots, and that was fine, but it didn't actually really transform anything. It's still valuable. RAG is still really important, especially as a tool for an agent, but chatbots and things like that just didn't live up to the promise that we all thought they might. And so when we're talking about agents, there's a difference between an agent and actually a workflow. So a chain and a workflow, these things are descriptive, or prescriptive rather. The same thing happens every time. This is a classic RAG chain, where every time someone asks a question, it will always go and retrieve a certain number of documents. It'll always bundle those things together and say, hey, LLM, answer the question with all this context I provide to you, right? With agents, though, there's optionality. So we call these things agents because they have agency to choose what to do. And these are our ugly James and Will slides. They're not Databricks marketing slides, so apologies for the diagrams. But again, an agent is just an LLM with resources, right? So in this diagram, this LLM does something called function calling to go pick which tool to use. And that's what it does, it picks. Depending on the nature of the prompt, it can choose whether to do vector search or hit an API or retrieve structured data in this case. So we're going to work through some real examples of how this looks in Databricks. But I put MCP there because, and we're going to talk more about some of the sort of standards and frameworks in this space that are becoming more and more popular. There's actually a talk about MCP right after this one by the people who are building MCP on Databricks. But there's lots of ways to do tools. We'll talk about the Databricks way of doing tools today, but there's many, many ways to build tools. And I guess the other thing to note here too is that the agent might not just use one tool. The agent might use a combination of multiple of these things depending on the nature of the question, or maybe the agent says, the retrieval from the vector search was terrible. I'm going to go back and do it again with a different phrase. So we'll see some of that today.
Okay, cool. And so we're going to go a little bit into the considerations for healthcare and life sciences. We talked a bit about tools. Like one of the ideas here that is directly applicable is that we don't want a tool with just like unfettered access to an entire database. We want it to make sure that it is like the atomic unit, that it can do what it needs to do without actually having any potential ramifications and minimizing that blast radius if something does go wrong, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about these considerations in more depth before we go into the end-to-end demo. So what are some of the important things that we want to actually consider when we're building these agents in healthcare and life sciences? First one's pretty obvious in terms of compliance. I know a lot of people here love HIPAA, and we all do, right? And so HIPAA, high trust, and GXP compliance are just a few of them. In our industry, whenever we're working with medical information or health records and stuff like that, personal identifiable information, and the like, we have some compliance standards that we have to adhere to, and so that's an obvious one that we have to consider when we're designing the system. In some cases, people will anonymize the data, so that way they can get around in terms of those compliance. But in other cases, like Databricks focuses on making sure that our features are HIPAA compliant, so you don't have to worry about that. Another thing that kind of goes hand in hand is monitoring and auditability. We talked a bit about how the agents work. In some cases, it can be a black box, which is definitely not good in healthcare and life sciences, where we need to have auditability, which oftentimes goes hand in hand with compliance. So if I need to have my records for the last 7 years stored, but then I find out that, oh, we never actually implemented tracing with agents, and I have a really bad time. And so also, how do we make sure that these assets are secured, which leads into governance. We'll talk a little bit about Unity Catalog. Now, in addition to the agent and making sure that this is accessible by the right people, we also have these tools that we want to make sure are also secured, and making sure that if we have something that pulls patient record information, we don't want someone to have access or modify that tool, and we absolutely do not want data exfiltration. In healthcare and life sciences, the ramifications of like having a margin of error, and this is why we're talking about safety and accuracy with evals. The margin of error is near zero. There's zero tolerance in a lot of cases because, for example, if an agent that is like a clinical note summarization tells a physician that someone had a diagnosis of bronchitis or something like that, and then they schedule accordingly or they speak accordingly to a patient, and it turns out it's actually already progressed into pneumonia, and that time to care is actually really critical for the prognosis. That is something that is a very deep concern, right? We're talking about people's lives, their livelihood. That is, in terms of the error here that we can accept is zero. So how do we make sure that the agent is safe, but also accurate? And how do we make sure that these evaluations are even pertinent? Because if you if you write some questions and it answers it correctly, that's not really indicative of most real world scenarios, or you might miss edge cases that could lead to a potentially fatal event or a severe event that we don't want. So we need to be extra careful with that. And so we have a quote here where we need to make sure that we design and build AI that helps healthcare professionals. Essentially, we need to help people do what they need to do, right? I think a lot of the time we're talking about this is going to replace certain flows, but I'm sure everybody here has heard efficiency many, many times over the last couple months or in our entire lives, right? So how do we make sure that these tools are helping people do what they do best? And so, we're going to go see an agentic system in action, and James is going to walk through some of the tools.
All right, so we're going to do an end-to-end demo. It's a real demo. And so this is going to be a healthcare example. But one of the things that we often start with agents and RAG is unstructured data. But what we want to do today is show you a demo of building agents for structured data because it's a little bit different. So imagine that we have all this structured admissions data. This is actually a real Mimic-3 data set released by the Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital System. And so this is real admissions data. And I'm going to zoom in on things when they're important, don't worry. And I might want to answer specific questions. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a clinical assistant chatbot, right? And that clinical assistant chatbot isn't just going to do RAG on some unstructured data. We're going to build a chatbot that actually retrieves specific structured data to actually improve that clinician's information, right? So we're going to build a couple of different things for that agent. We're going to build tools. And one of the tools we're going to build is a way to retrieve recent admissions for a particular patient, right? So I have this structured data set, this admissions data set of all this information. And I also have some other structured data. I also have things like clinical notes. So I might want to retrieve relevant clinical notes for a particular patient. I also have labs. So I have lab items here and lab events. So I'm going to retrieve lab events and the types of labs they are. That way I can ask questions like, what was the patient's most recent admission? Did they have any abnormal labs? What labs were those? And what was the sort of clinical disposition of that patient when they were discharged, right? It's a very useful set of questions to be able to ask. And so all that, for the most part, is structured data. And the way we do this in Databricks is by building things called tools. And in Unity Catalog, we actually have a tool catalog now, where you can actually create simple tools. I'm going to zoom in on this. This is a simple SQL query that just finds the most recent admission for a particular patient ID, right? Really, really simple. But when I create this as a tool or a function in Unity Catalog, I can give that as a tool to an agent, right? So we created this thing called get latest admission, and it's super simple. First, the process by which you do this is first you find a query that is relevant to what an agent might need, and then you wrap that in a function. And a function comes with things like a description. That's what helps the agent choose that tool. It also comes with function metadata. That way the agent knows what the input parameter is to that function, right? In this case, it's patient ID, which is an integer. And so we know that as the output of that, the return, it's going to expect sort of a table of information. So this is a super simple tool, but this tool allows an agent to pass in a patient ID and get back the most recent admission for that patient using that query. And I built a few other tools here too. I have things like get lab type, which is sort of an output after doing get abnormal labs. So this is a super simple way to get recent abnormal labs for a particular admission. So in that first question, I might ask, what's the most recent admission? And the second question might be, given that admission, did they have any abnormal labs, right? And it uses this tool to get abnormal labs using this really simple query from the lab events table, right? And the special thing about these in Databricks is they're governable. So just like regular table, like if I click on this table, of course I can set permissions on the table, just like anything else in Unity Catalog. But this also acts as a tool catalog. So I can do governance on this function. And I could go find my friend Will. He's already down there. But I'll find William. And I can say, William, or perhaps a group of data scientists, they're now allowed to execute this function, right? So I can grant people permission to execute functions. When we talk about agents later, we don't just do governance on agents, we do governance on the underlying data and the tools those agents have access to. So I built a few of my functions here, super simple, and I can copy this, and I can go over to the playground just to test it out. Will's going to actually productionize this in a minute and do a real example. I'm going to show you how to sort of test things out. So I can pick whatever LLM I want. If you're not already aware, Databricks is LLM agnostic. You can pick models provided by Databricks, the Llama models, the cloud models, but also you can connect to your own private enterprise models. So Azure OpenAI, Bedrock, whatever you want to use. I might pick GPT-4o, or in this case, I'll use Llama. And these models are able to use tools. So that's this section up here. And today we announced, actually, in the keynote, so I can add this in, we announced that all tools that you build in Databricks are actually going to be exposed via MCP as well, which is sort of that standard protocol these days for exposing tools for agents. But I'm going to add in my tools here, right? So I'm going to add in my get abnormal labs. I'm going to add in my get lab type. And I might add in get clinical notes as well.
Just noting too that if you have a variety of tools in a catalog, you could always just add that entire catalog so that your LLM can use all of those tools as well.
If I can type properly, it's patient 22's most recent admission. So I'm going to ask this question. And because in those tools that we created, while that runs, because in those tools we created, we added a description. You notice I didn't add a system prompt here or anything crazy to tell the LLM what to do. The LLM has that comment on those tools it has access to, so it can choose which tool is most appropriate to answer the question. And of course, because I asked about the patient's most recent admission, it can use that get latest admission tool by passing in that input parameter, patient ID, and it gets back this structured result from that table, right? So it says, yeah, the most recent admission was on this date and this happened. And I might ask, did they have any abnormal labs? and I'll spell it wrong on purpose just because the LLM can handle that. So now it's going to use the get abnormal labs tool to go retrieve the abnormal labs that patient had from the table. So you see this table of abnormal labs coming back, and then it's intelligently saying, oh, I'm going to get the types of those labs. And then it says, yeah, this patient had several labs, and they were this kind of labs, right? And this is fine. You can sort of see in the interface that it's rendering the tool call, but it also might be hallucinating that. So what we also have in Databricks is a way of tracing what agents do. So I can see exactly what the agent does and the actual tool calls and the inputs and outputs of all of those tool calls at every step, right? And when you build an agent on Databricks, you don't just see the tracing in this sort of playground UI. Every agent built on Databricks gets tracing, no matter where it is, right? And it's not just agents built on Databricks. If you go to any of the evaluation deep dives this week, you can actually use this evaluation and tracing and monitoring on agents anywhere, even outside of Databricks. But with that, the final step here is, okay, I say, yep, I sort of did a vibe test on this, it looks good. I actually want to deploy this as an agent with code, right? Well, Databricks actually automatically generates the code for that too. I can click that Get Code button, generate agent code, and it automatically creates the notebook for me to define the agent. And right now, we use LangGraph, which is sort of the big open source framework for building agents, but any framework is fine on Databricks. We're framework agnostic, so OpenAI, LangGraph, AutoGen, semantic kernel, whatever framework your organization prefers to use, you can build and serve on Databricks. But with that, I'm going to switch over to Will, and he's going to walk through productionizing this.
Sweet, thank you. And so just also highlighting that in that playground, James was able to connect those tools without any code and then start iterating on it. So it's really great for prototyping because you also get the output notebook. But normally if you wanted to start doing your toolkit, you'd have to learn how to actually add that array and then make a graph and all that stuff with LangGraph, which can also be time consuming. My existing agent is 600 lines of code that I had a wonderful time writing. And so you don't have to do that, and you can work with the playground. Now when we formalize it, I'm not going to go through this code, but I want to show a couple things that make it a bit easier to start doing evaluation. So we saw the trace a good bit that James showed, and pardon my scrolling here. I'm going to go into this driver notebook and scroll a little bit more. One thing that has come up with evaluations are that they're kind of difficult to do, but also difficult to get the information to do evaluations. So in the example of having like a physician that is your subject matter expert, you need to get that person to write out the expected input and output, and then have them make sure that that is your gold standard for the data frame that you're testing this agent. It's difficult to get subject matter experts, like honestly, it's difficult to get documentation in general for a lot of cases, let alone when you have subject matter experts like physicians or surgeons or stuff like that, or nurse practitioners or what have you, that may not have the time nor understand the language that these models are like really trying to speak with us to like make sure that the evaluations are not only correct and appropriate, but also have relevant information in terms of the expected facts that go along with the ground truth label. So we actually have something called the generate evals df. So I can add my table here and then have how many number of evals that I want. And zooming in here, we can see that all I did in the Databricks agent evaluations, which is our focus on doing evaluations and making it easier and very powerful. In this case, we actually hand wrote all the examples prior. And a fun thing that wasn't actually part of this demo is I think I can actually show them here, where James wrote this request by hand, and that was our evaluation. So let's do it a little smarter, and that we can have this generation of this eval set where we can give the guidelines, including the tools that it's expecting, and what we end up getting from the data that we have, that is our source. That's our source of truth, so we know it's correct, right? It's not someone's opinion when they're making up questions or what have you. It's coming from the actual data that we're using. When we display this evals with that like 6 lines of code plus the strings, we can see here that I have the request, in this case the diagnosis for this patient, and this patient exists in the table because it came from that information. We also have the expected retrieved content, which is the direct information that it's going to be looking at. Sorry for the scrolling, or the zooming rather. the expected facts, which is going to help our LLM as a judge really understand what it's trying to judge, because I had a conversation earlier today where in some cases the LLM can get it right or wrong with normally if it gets it right with the ground truth, it can just kind of make up rationale. Or if it says this is wrong, it can kind of make up very convincing rationale, and that's not what we want, because unless you're really combing through every single reasoning, something might slip through the cracks. We need to make sure that these expected facts are in fact facts, and they come from the actual data itself. They're not just something someone's ideating. And so that's going to really help us. And again, I only did that with this, in this case with the strings, about like 15 lines of code. And so that's extremely powerful. We're going to use this to then get started with our evaluations, which we can see here with MLflow, how we do MLOps and LLMOps, that we're going to get this agent that we had trained in this regard in terms of like the actual agent file that we logged MLflow, use that evals data frame, and this is where like we really want to start talking about the safety of this model. Because we know that it's coming from the data that it has access to, and this is like a real scenario, we can then get very granular with what we're testing and making sure that it's performing correctly rather than, this is an opinion on something, or it might be like a fuzzy question. So in this case, we saw that MLflow evaluate and then tested the agent that we had logged. And so one thing is that we could look at a table, but more importantly, let's go into this evaluation. And so now when we go to this evaluations, we can see here that we can see the full trace. And so this is all, I didn't do anything outside behind the scenes or whatever, no hand waving and magic here. I just did that evaluation with that data set that I created from our underlying data. And we can see here that in these assessments, we have overall, which was all the tests, we have clarity, correctness, groundedness, and these are all built in. You can do custom metrics as well and make it so that there is an LLM evaluating the response of the other one. And that way we can understand the responses contextually, because it's very difficult to evaluate NLP in like a very cohesive manner that we can rely on. There are some metrics, but we can talk about that another time. But let's see here. We can see that there are 3 that failed in this set. And I did 10 for the example. Some people do 50 to 100. You can do whatever you want there. So let's dig into this. We see this really nice UI with colors. Let's dig into one that failed. So in this case, we see what is the most recent diagnosis for the most recent, or what was the diagnosis for the most recent admission of this patient. Let's see what's going on here. Like we saw the trace, but most importantly, let's look at the right-hand side. We can see that those expected facts and that expected retrieval is here. They exist here. We see what it should retrieve, which is great that we can see the retriever is working. We can also see the expected facts for this content that were not just like generated like in terms of someone's opinion. These are directly from the information that we should have access to. And let's see, even better, let's look, okay, I know it's not correct, but even better, let's see why it was not correct. If I zoom out here and zoom again, we can see here that the feedback, it says that it's not correct. We have a rationale. We have a reason and explanation of why the LLM thought that this was wrong. And this is automatically logged. In this case, there was an expectation that the diagnosis was for a basal cell carcinoma, but the actual response we saw was a coronary artery disease. And so we have a definitive rationale as to why this was wrong, and we have it all logged across all these examples, and then we can continuously do this every iteration, so we always have a trail of this, and we know what model is performing what, and then we have some consistency with that. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see that we're registering this model, and so now instead of doing the playground with those tools attached, we now have an endpoint that we can hit as a REST API endpoint from any of your applications or what have you. When we go over to this real quick, we'll go back to the playground. I selected that agent that I deployed, and I can use it directly in the playground, where now I can see what was the diagnosis on this one, and then see that this was the diagnosis, and we can then look at the trace again and see every single aspect that it was doing, which is incredibly important now that we've evaluated to see, like, in terms of accuracy and safety. We also have this trace, so then we also have the auditability and monitoring that we were talking about earlier. So now if I have to go back and say that there was an issue with this LLM or this agent with a patient or a physician or what have you, we can go back and not have a black box where you just don't know what happened or hope that whoever was using it remembers what happened, right? We can go into exactly what it was thinking, what tools that it called, what then it did with those tools, and we can see that it was using the get latest admission, and then we can go into each of these, see the inputs, the outputs, the additional metadata in terms of which model it was using, and everything like that. So this is incredibly important for the safety, observability, and all of that. We're gonna go a little bit from this back into our slides, and then we'll explain a bit more about the application of this in healthcare and life sciences.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk through life sciences use cases first. He'll talk through some healthcare ones. We're going to go a little bit quick through these. Happy to talk afterwards in depth about how these things work. But between the two of us, we've seen a lot of use cases. Both, we're both data scientists prior to the advent of AI. So both classic data science and now agentic use cases. We're going to focus just on agentic ones in this talk, but happy to talk about anything else afterwards. So in life sciences, I'm just going to click through these things. Kind of like I was mentioning in the beginning, people often started with RAG use cases, whether that is, employee handbook PDFs, medical literature, sort of retrieval, lots of sort of PubMed PDF use cases that I've seen. The slightly more advanced one I thought was pretty interesting was helping to author regulatory doc submissions using retrieved context from prior regulatory docs. But as we move into agents, whether that's agent systems with tools or text-to-SQL or multi-agent orchestration. One thing we're not really hitting on today, but that is a super common use case is, I'm sure today or yesterday you've heard a lot about Databricks Genie. And Databricks Genie is really special because it can be used as an agent in a multi-agent system. There's an API, we don't always talk about it, but there's an API for Genie that can be treated as an agent to do text-to-SQL for you. So lots of customers that I've talked to have tried to do their own text-to-SQL, which is a really difficult engineering problem, but Genie helps solve some of that stuff. They can just treat Genie as a text-to-SQL agent. It does all that work for you and retrieves back the structured data. So a few of these things, like I'm going to talk more in depth about the sales rep next best action one on the next slide, but the final thing is we talked a lot about fine-tuning and pre-training in 2023, 2024. We do a bit less of that now just because LLMs themselves have gotten so good at so many things, and also they're incredibly cheap nowadays, which is amazing. But we still have customers doing fine-tuning and pre-training on Databricks, like especially this drug discovery one. I think Merck was here talking about that one this week, but there are other customers that do that as well. And for very, very large scale, sort of like, this one I talk about is clinical note entity extraction, but for very large scale structured information extraction from unstructured data, it's actually really useful to train smaller models to do that because of costs. You might purchase 100 million clinical notes from Optum and want to extract information from those things, so it's worthwhile to use a smaller model for that. So I'm going to go a little bit deeper into one really interesting one, and this is my ugly diagram, so I apologize, but in life sciences organizations in their commercial units, they of course have a sales force, and it's a really common use case that they want to empower that sales force in some way to do their own, not necessarily analyses, but to do their own asking questions about data. And so every life sciences organization, of course, does journey orchestration. They do their own next best action, but empowering a salesperson to ask questions about an HCP, to ask whether they've been contacted recently, have they used any samples, do they have any patients with a particular diagnosis. Those are all really valuable questions that a sales rep might ask. And in their case, this is a multi-agent system. They used a Genie agent that had a bunch of HCP data. It actually had a bunch of IQVIA data in this case, so I put that on the very bottom in green, but it also has sort of HCP interactions data and a few other things. And that Genie space does the job of all the text to SQL. So it translates that question, looks at all the metadata of all the tables it has, generates the SQL, executes it, and returns back that structured information, right? And then another part of it was later on, they wanted to add in the ability for those sales reps to ask about their compensation. And so we added a second Genie space with specific sales rep compensation data. This was a complicated one because of governance. Of course, like you shouldn't be able to ask what your colleague's compensation is. And so they really had to figure out how to pass through the identity all the way through from the person asking it, to the supervisor agent, to the Genie space. And that's one thing you can do in Databricks is not just embed credentials in your agent, but you can do identity pass-through all the way through to the data, which is quite nice. The next one is a research assistant. So this is a simple one. This was, a bunch of customers have done something similar to this, where they have a bunch of unstructured data. And some people are tempted to sort of dump all of that unstructured data into one single vector search index, but oftentimes it's more effective to put sort of domain-specific data into different vector search indexes. So in this case, we split by therapeutic area. And so there's a supervisor agent, which is sort of a common pattern in this case, that can use either internal search data, so 3 different vector search indexes for different therapeutic areas, but it can also go and do a PubMed search. And one thing you'll notice in the purple, the dotted lines there, are tool calls. So of course, the supervisor agent is choosing which agent to use, kind of like a tool, but these search agents are choosing which tools are best based on the nature of the question. So like we were talking about earlier, you create and define tools, and it's really easy to create unstructured search tools in Databricks. We did structured today in the demo, but it's very similar for vector search indexes. And depending on the nature of the question, it can choose which therapeutic area to go do retrieval on. And because this isn't RAG, this is agentic retrieval, if what is retrieved is not good, it could choose to go do retrieval again. Maybe it rephrases the question, maybe it rephrases the question in a few different ways and does retrieval on all of those questions. Those are all things that you can do with these types of agents.
Thank you. And so now we're going to go into the use cases in healthcare. There are going to be a couple diagrams. There's a test after. Everyone will get a piece of paper, and we need you guys to draw all of them from memory. So just kidding. So we did a little bit about this. Really, the main thing that we want to talk about in the buckets, they're similar. So I won't go too much into it, was the evolution in terms of retrieval augmented generation, agent systems, and then multi-agent systems. I think there is sometimes a fallacy that people think that one is inherently better than the other, and so in some cases people try to use one kind of architecture for everything. Knowledge stores are still incredibly important, but also fine-tuning is still important, and agent systems, even though they're the newest and hottest, they are very important, right? So in this case, we're not going to go too much into which of these are these blocks, but the main thing that we talk about in terms of like social needs intervention, when we're talking about agents, well, if we have a chatbot interface, that's one thing, but how do we make sure that these agents work in a way that's autonomously and then more efficient for our organization? In this case, we want to know if a particular patient exhibits signs that they have social needs, and then what do we do with that? So how do we detect that and act autonomously from the data from the clinical notes? In this case, we have multiple in terms of steps where this agent can then do what it needs to do in terms of augmentation. It can get the clinical notes. It can then do classification on the social needs that are categorized based on what the internal documentation and requirements are in terms of if someone has lack of transport and they can't get to a doctor, they have food scarcity or insecurity and stuff like that. That is really important when we're actually trying to target care. Then we can do entity extraction as well and making sure that we understand the relationships in these notes and all do this autonomously, so then we can get a final where we get a next best action with this augmented table, so that practitioners, where they're a human in the loop, where they're still going to be humans in terms of this workflow, it's not going to be completely autonomous because we want to check for certain things. And then we also have the patients that are impacted by this. There's a great example of having an agent do a lot of work that we don't necessarily need manual kind of classification on this, because having someone sit down and read through every single note and classify is definitely viable, but we have tools that can do this, and that way we can target patients more effectively as well as faster. We can determine their needs as soon as the notes land, and we can go from there. Other thing that we're going to talk about is patient throughput and staff burnout. We talked a bit about efficiency. A lot of people are trying to do more with less. That's a classic thing, right? How do we make sure that we are allocating practitioners effectively and also making sure that we're not contributing to attrition? We don't want to over-assign someone or under-assign people in cases that if inpatient and outpatient are separate in the system, then, and we get that wrong, then we might have idling resources in one, and in the other, they might be swamped. We don't want that, right? And so in this case, we can have this agent that combines with streaming capacity of different ICUs and ERs and the like. We can then use these agents to figure out what the capacity is going on and the trends with this, just based on the information that's coming in, the notes and stuff like that, and then tell us what is going on with some of these and maybe highlight some trends that we need to actually look at and take action on. So in this case, we can actually look at how are we going to plan these resource allocation. We can do it in real time because we're doing this autonomously, so that if I look at a table like from yesterday or even like today, I can see at any given ER what the capacity is, and as well as like maybe the recommendations on the allocation there or potential idling resources. We can make this pipeline that can understand the notes and the numbers and everything like that, and then give us this kind of view instead of having someone work down on analyze the data and make a dashboard and stuff like that. That's absolutely viable. This makes it though that we have an agent workflow that can do this system for us, and then we can rely on it and then iterate on top of it. And it's also very understandable for the people who are using it in terms of if someone who built this system, like in terms of pure like SQL or analysis, what if they go on vacation or something like that and we don't have explainability of what's going on and then something happens, right? In this case, we can actually work with natural language and then design the system so that it's more understandable, as well as commenting on itself so that we understand the reasoning and how it's working and then how to iterate on it. So we're going to go a little bit on what's coming next. We have a few minutes so that y'all can see what we're working on and what is going on in the industry. And so, yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think this is just the way that we think about it. It's not a formalized term, but when people started building agents, we noticed a lot of analytical agents. And think of that as like where an agent might retrieve huge swaths of information, structured or unstructured, and you're kind of fine where it takes a long time. It's retrieving, analyzing, maybe it's answering sort of arbitrary questions. Genie is a good example of an analytical agent. But I'm seeing more and more use cases where operational agents are becoming important, where they're embedded maybe in a workflow or super low latency needs are required. So it's an interesting dynamic where an operational agent, maybe you need to define a small set of problems that it needs to solve and do those very quickly, whereas analytical agents might need to answer sort of arbitrary questions and analyze data for you. So it's an interesting thing. I'm starting to see more operational agents. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say competing standards, but there's lots of upcoming standards in this space. MCP stands for Model Context Protocol. It's a standard protocol invented by Anthropic. It's open source for exposing tools to agents. And I get a lot of questions about MCP. It's very rare I do a meeting about agents and I don't get asked about MCP. But as you might have heard today in the keynote, we're standardizing an MCP as well. So if you build a tool in Databricks, it can be exposed via MCP. You can also host custom MCP servers on Databricks. A2A is another interesting one. It's called agent to agent. It's from Google. And that's how agents talk to each other. And a lot of people are worried about how your different agents and different systems are going to talk to each other. I don't think this standard is as much of a standard yet, but there's lots of these things. Everybody asks about, should I use LangGraph or Crew AI or AutoGen? And there's a lot of froth in this space about standards and frameworks. I think this will become clearer maybe later this year, maybe next year. And then multi-agent systems. We kind of talked about it on that graph, but a lot of folks want to start building multi-agent systems before they really nail single-agent systems. But I think as we get better with some of those standards, with whether that's the interoperability, whether it's open source and the protocols between them, we're going to see more and more multi-agent systems, including agents living in multiple places. Like you might have a multi-agent system on Databricks where one of those agents is in a separate place.
Cool. Yep. And it's becoming more and more common with multi-agent systems as people are trying to optimize and make things more efficient. You can imagine like a call center where a patient calls in, and then there's different flows that they might take in terms of scheduling, information, and stuff like that. Those can be agents that do their own thing as well, so they're separated out. And that's kind of like the multi-agent in a nutshell. What do we do in terms of like agent evaluations that are actually effective? We went over a lot of things. This is going to be iterated. I personally do not think that many systems are implementing evaluations as a first principle or doing it really, really in depth. So we need to focus on making sure that these evals are done well and consistently. And we also have self-optimizing systems. If y'all have heard DSPy in terms of the idea that prompt engineering doesn't have to be iterative in terms of just writing, but we can programmatically update prompts and make things better and optimize them. We have direct integration and also working with that in terms of our engineering team on that. And what does that mean for prompt engineering and prompt tuning in the future, which was a huge, huge part. Entire roles were designed around that when LLMs really became productionalized. And so if you're going to take one thing away from today's session,
agents aren't that hard to build. We all did it together, but they are hard to evaluate. And that's why Databricks is so focused on the evaluations piece.
Yep, and evaluations mean trust and safety, which is paramount in our industry. And again, Databricks is trying to demystify that and make it a lot easier. And so thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your days. Yeah.